Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us at a different time for this edition of Find Your Fairy Tale. We're going live at 10 o'clock in the morning because today's guest is joining us from overseas, from London. It is journalist Clarissa Ward, and she has just released a new book. It's a memoir all about her experience as a journalist, covering some of the most conflicted areas in our world today. You know, when I started as a journalist, I thought that everybody covered war. And in many cases you do, if it lands on your doorstep. But it takes a certain type, a certain breed, a certain courage for a journalist to chase down the conflict, to jump into the heart of humanity when it's troubled the most, when it's violent, when we're fighting to survive. And that's why I'm so interested and so excited to talk to Clarissa today, because she has that courage and she has that drive. And in her book, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist, to how that became her calling and how she knew that that is how she wants to spend her time on this planet. So as we dig into how we want to spend our time, we're going to pick her brain today about how you find what's in your heart. Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
I am doing great, and I so appreciate you squeezing us in because I know that you are busy juggling a lot in life right now.
To sit on because I'm looking very tiny. So there we go. Okay.
There you go. I think it's all even now. It's just such a crazy time because we're talking to each other all in this remote way, but it's an interesting time because we are able to connect with people in a way that we weren't really readily doing before the pandemic hit. So
yeah, for sure.
I appreciate this connection so much. So, you know, for people who are joining us right now, let's start with your current role. Right now, you're juggling motherhood, being an author, and then chief international correspondent for CNN. You're on a little break right now, though, right?
Yes, I'm on my maternity leave. Although, frankly, releasing a book on your maternity leave is, it's not really a break. But it's good that I'm not working because it's a full-time job. Well, being a mother is a full-time job.
Yes.
Releasing a book is a full-time job. And my full-time job is also a full-time job. So there's a lot of balls being juggled at the moment, and many of them are landing on the floor. But I think that, you know, we're a little too hard on ourselves as women sometimes, and we just need to embrace and accept and go with the flow and not worry about being perfect.
Never. And you can be all things, not necessarily at once. Sometimes it's within the confines of a day. Sometimes it's your whole life, but you can kind of go full throttle at any of these things that could be completely all consuming. But getting to CNN from reading your book, that was essentially your happily ever after, your fairy tale. That was where you wanted to be. When did you first decide that you wanted to be a war correspondent, a conflict reporter? Because we've sort of expanded it out from just covering war to these moments that challenge us, you know, as a people. You go right into the heart of some of the darkest times that we face. What makes you chase that?
So for me, it's interesting always asking people this question because it is such a specific type of work. And I think for most of us, it's a calling of sorts. It's a vocation. And I really had no idea that I was going to end up doing this work. I was studying comparative literature at Yale. I was in my senior year. I thought I wanted to be an actress. I was making movies with my friends and publishing a magazine, and I loved languages and I loved traveling and I always loved storytelling. But it was only after 9/11 that I had this sort of epiphany. And I think, like all Americans, 9/11 was like a thunderbolt from the sky. It was like so shocking and just turned your whole world upside down. And I couldn't get over the fact of, why hadn't I been more engaged with the world? Why had I not seen this coming? Why didn't I have a deeper knowledge of these complex undercurrents that were leading to this mass miscommunication and hatred and dehumanization? And so I felt really passionately in that moment that I wanted to go there, wherever there was. I was a little hazy on the details initially. And I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to tell people's stories and bring them back home to the US as well. And my hope at that time was that in this process of bringing my stories to these places and taking those places' stories back home, that I could work as some kind of a translator between worlds, and that I could do something that would help to humanize people, to emphasize shared human connection, to really put an end to this miscommunication that I felt was fueling a lot of the hatred and a lot of the misunderstanding. Keep in mind, I was 22.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had a lot of really big, lofty ideas about what I wanted to do. And eventually reality sets in, and you see that it's a much more complex picture even than I could have understood in that moment. But that was the pivotal moment for me, and I knew right away it was conflict. I knew I wanted to go to the tip of the spear.
I love that how you put it, as a translator between worlds, because that's really what it is. And when I was thinking about, what you do compared to what I do, we started off, I was doing the math as I read your book, and I was like, oh, okay, 9/11. That was my very first day as a contributing journalist. I was an intern, but I was writing for a little newspaper in New Hampshire as their Washington, D.C. correspondent. And our first day in the newsroom was 9/11. So all of a sudden we were running around tracking down interns who were lost in the Capitol, and getting reaction from congressmen. And this was sort of this trial by fire. And I couldn't not want to be there. And I really was digging into that in that moment. What is it that makes you want to dive into some of the most frightening moments? And I think it is that you get to see, by looking at the darkest part of us, the best part of us as well.
That is very true. And I always tell people that. They're like, are you not so depressed by what you see?
Yeah.
And your work is so much misery. And I say, look, I see the worst of humanity, but I also see the best of humanity. And I think people often forget that. Even in war zones, you see incredible acts of kindness and courage and heroism and sacrifice that you don't see as much when you're at home. The other thing that I think maybe people forget is it's exciting, right? And I don't want to glamorize it, because I think that there is a tendency to glamorize being a war correspondent, and I don't actually think that that's terribly helpful. But no doubt, it's exciting. You're out there on the front lines with a front row seat on history, and it feels thrilling. It's a privilege. It's exciting. It's fascinating. And once you've done that for a while, the idea of going back to an office job seems very, very difficult. It's hard to contemplate even.
Yeah, it's even, I write fiction too, and I choose to write in the young adult sphere because I liken it to covering news, where I say writing from the adult point of view, looking backwards, is like sifting through the ashes of a terrible fire. And you put together the pieces and you move forward and you come out a better human. But for me, I want to dive right into the fire. And those moments are when you're this teenager feeling everything, wondering about everything, and exploding into the world. So similarly, you're getting right into, the moment in which we're formed and we catapult forward. But you fought your way onto television in a different way. I mean, all of us, I think, for people who are watching right now who don't know how hard it is to get on TV, you're told everywhere, every step of the way, it's not necessarily going to happen for you. And for me, I almost have to pretend, you have to pretend that you don't want to be on TV, because there's something, there's, I just want to be on TV. You're a journalist at the heart of it. And so you say all these things, like, it doesn't matter if I do, but it does, because you want to be the face, you want to be the voice, you want to be that communicator, not for ego, but because that's your passion.
That's your skill. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what you want to do. And so I followed all the rules that I was taught. You start in a small market in the United States, and you carry your own camera, and you interview, you one-man band, you're an MMJ now, they call it, a multimedia journalist. And you go from small market to medium market to big market, and then maybe you make it to the network, and then maybe you make it to CNN. But you said, you know what, I'm just going to intern my way into this world. And you were relentless in basically begging to go to Baghdad, because that's what brave journalists do.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was lucky in a sense, because I came of age as a journalist in the post 9/11 world, as you did too. And there were a lot of wars. There was the war in
Hmm.
Afghanistan, there was the war in Iraq, there was the occupation, and that meant that journalists had to be there. And
Yeah.
American audiences were really engaged and interested. The reality is, though, with Iraq, it became so dangerous, so difficult to tell the story, that about 2 years in, a lot of journalists really didn't want to go anymore.
Mm.
They felt that the American public was losing interest. It was too hot. It was way too scary. A lot of really understand, and it was very limiting in terms of the stories that you could tell, and which I completely understand. But that provided an opening for me, because essentially I could be the person being like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, but last time I checked, there isn't a long line of people wanting to go and be producers in Iraq for the summer. And so after a year of harassing my boss, Brian Knobloch, who was the foreign editor at Fox News, I was working on the overnight assignment desk, which is like beyond the lowest rung on the totem pole. So let it never be said that I didn't pay my dues. But eventually he was like, fine, you can go. And so he sent me in the summer, and then I made a sort of radical move. I quit Fox and I set up shop as a freelancer living in Beirut. And I knew that because of the war in Iraq, there would always be work for me in Baghdad. And so I would do 6 weeks in Baghdad and then 6 weeks off in Beirut. Of course, what happened is that then there was a war in Lebanon, and I was also covering Gaza. And so before I knew it,
Hmm.
instead of like 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off, it was more like always on, always covering conflict. But I was lucky because they finally gave me a break to be in front of the camera, as long as I would go for Christmas, New Year's, and Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's to Baghdad. And I was like, oh
So
my
the
God.
time that people normally want to be with their
Yeah,
families,
any
you were like,
sane
okay, that sounds
person
great.
wants to
I'll
be,
go
yeah.
work
And
the
I was like,
holidays.
sign me up. I'm in Baghdad for the holiday season. Great. And you know what? Saddam Hussein was executed a few days after Christmas, and no one else was there. So I was doing live shots for 36 hours straight. And it's, as you said, it was like baptism by fire. Like, I knew in that moment that I could do the job and that there was no other job I wanted to do.
Why was there no other job you wanted to do? And were you scared? And not scared that from your book it sounded like you were more scared of going live and in some way messing up the story, messing up the details than dying, to be honest. I
Yeah.
mean, you were in literally the line of fire so many times. Did
So I
that
think,
ever make you want to stop?
yeah, I mean, look, I think when you're really young, you think you're invincible,
Mm.
even when you're in a conflict zone. And it's only after you've had like a couple of close calls that you start to really understand that, like, this isn't a game, this isn't a movie, like, this is you, this is your life, and you are putting yourself in very dangerous positions, and things can go wrong. And you have much more of a sense of the weight of responsibility that comes with that kind of frontline work. When you're young, you're just like, yeah, whatever, this is great, this is exciting, I'm doing
You run toward
interesting
it.
work.
You run right
You
into it.
run toward it, exactly.
Hmm.
And as I got older and as I understood it more and as I lost people who were close to me, I definitely changed my attitude towards risk. I'm much more risk averse. I still do assignments that by any measure of a normal person's spectrum are dangerous, but I don't actively put myself in situations where I'm in the line of fire. So right now, I like to do the kind of work where I go to dangerous places and get as close as I can to be able to tell the stories of lives who are affected by these wars or conflicts or whatever it may be that are playing out. But I'm not going to be the best military analyst. So there's no reason for me to be hunkered down in a ditch watching bullets flying over my head, aside from the fact that it's petrifying. I'm not going to be the best person to like break down for you what exactly the military significance is of that. I'm much more interested in telling people's stories. Now, the reality is, in order to tell those stories, you do have to get really close to the front
Hmm.
lines. And when you spend time anywhere near a front line, you realize it doesn't, you can be the most sensible person and do things above board in every single way. And it's not always the dangers that you expect that are the ones that end up, potentially claiming your life or injuring people. apparently one security guy once told me the number one cause of death for war correspondents are car accidents. Which kind of makes sense because you're driving with drivers you maybe haven't vetted.
Right.
You're not usually obeying the speed limit. You might be
Right.
driving at night. You might be driving with no headlights if it's a dangerous situation. Often I've driven in cars that don't have seatbelts. So it's just like a different, I think everyone assumes that the big risk is getting bombed. And of course that is a big risk, but there's a plethora of other risks as well that come with working in these kinds of places.
And in this field in particular, but in general too, there's a question of knowing when when is enough, when is
Yeah.
enough, and
Yeah.
knowing when you have the story or when you've achieved, whether you're not a journalist, when you've achieved what it is that you're chasing, and it's time to take a step back. There was an editor that you mentioned, a famous editor.
Oh, yeah.
What was his line? It said, "Cannot file if dead."
Cannot file if dead. And that is a really important lesson to people, to remember that there's no point in doing any of this if you're not going to make it to tell the story, right? So your survival has to be a major factor in the planning of how you go about doing any trip. And that's a crucial element. I don't think people sometimes understand how much planning goes into these trips. I mean, we're talking sometimes months of preparation, negotiations with different sides for access, for protection. Security analysts have to weigh in and offer their thoughts and their plans. You have to have exit strategies. There's a huge amount of thought and effort that goes into planning every single trip and making sure not just that you're not putting your own life in danger, but also that you're not putting the lives of others in danger. Don't forget, I get to go home at the end of the assignment, but the people who I work with on the ground, they stay there. And people will know that they've worked with CNN. And so I take it very seriously, the responsibility I have to those people who have worked with me to make sure that they are going to be safe as well.
And the other challenge for you, whether we like it or not, is as a woman, you're going into conflict zones where it's even less common for a woman to be where you are. And your experience in Syria in particular, I mean, you had to have a whole network of people who trusted you to be able to speak to the leaders that you did. You would essentially disguise, for lack of a better word, yourself, in traditional garb and be blindfolded to show up where you were interviewing.
Yeah.
And that is really going to an extent that many would say, wow, are you crazy? But you are crazy about telling that story. And
Yeah.
Syria has sort of set itself in your heart
No, it
as a
definitely
place
has.
that is your story to tell.
It definitely has. And here's the other thing I would say. There are some people who will invest lots of money in having the best body armor, in having the best armored vehicle, in having the best huge hulking security guy. And I'm not saying that stuff isn't important. It is. My version of that is to invest in the relationships with people on the ground, in building up trust, in establishing a kind of mutual understanding of how we're going to protect each other and respect each other, regardless of the fact that I am a Western female journalist and they might be a jihadist leader, right? But there's somewhere in the middle that we can meet and that we can agree upon. And my main preoccupation with a lot of my work has been finding those people, finding that middle ground. It doesn't mean I endorse what they do. It doesn't mean I am giving them a platform. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that I understand that my real protection is probably not going to come only from a bulletproof vest, but it's going to come from having a better sense of the anatomy of a community and who the major power brokers are, and gaining their trust and presenting myself to them in a way that is kind of honest and authentic about what the goal of my work is, so that they don't feel cheated, they don't feel hoodwinked, they don't feel caught off guard. And then they are the people ultimately who will protect you, especially in a place like Syria, where, it's not like any normal conflict I had covered where I could go back to my hotel, drive back from the front lines at the end of the day, and I'm staying in a hotel with a bunch of Western journalists, and there are other Westerners there too. No, in Syria, we were embedded deeply with rebel forces, and earlier on, even with activists. And so, like, these are the people who are going to protect you. These are the people who are going to keep you safe.
It's so interesting what you say in terms of your own personal protection. And all I can think about is your contribution and your job on a whole. And your mission is to do that for nations, for people. You know, if we could do those things and instead of focus on the body armor and
Yeah.
look at the relationships, that would
Yeah.
solve so many of the deep-rooted conflicts that you cover if we could do that as a society. But
Yeah.
it must be frustrating though, because when you see something broken, when you see and you get attached to the people, and you see death, and you see children, the stories that you've covered can make you cry watching them, let alone covering them.
Yeah.
How do you not get angry that you can't fix it?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that it's a really good question. It's taken me a long time to, I think, make peace with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Syria was the place where I finally understood that that's not my job. And it was kind of a really freeing moment to like hand it over to the universe and be like, oh, I should have a much more humble understanding of my job. My job isn't to solve the world's problems. My job is to go to places where there are problems, to shine a light on them, to give people in those places an opportunity to tell their stories, to bear witness, and to kind of write it all down. But my job is not to then go and work out how we solve the problem and then precipitate whatever political action would be needed to make that happen. So in Syria, I felt very strongly and I was very angry that the international community had really kind of led the Syrians on to make them think that they would help, and then they didn't end up helping. And because the Syrians believed that they were going to get help, they were willing to take extraordinary risks and do very dangerous things because they were so convinced that the international community would be coming in to rescue them. So I felt very strongly that for a number of reasons, whether it was like moral abdication or whether it was the precedent that it showed the rest of the world that America said something like chemical weapons are a red line, and then Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, just marched right across that red line and nothing happened to him. I felt really strongly that America had sort of created a moral hazard almost. And, you know, you'll read in the book, there's that moment where I end up writing an email late at night to Ben Rhodes, who was President Obama's foreign policy advisor, saying, "Dear Ben, I hope you're sleeping soundly as Aleppo burns," which, you know, definitely I crossed the line, right? That is crossing a line. And
it is, but even as you said it out loud and as I read it, I get the chills of raw honesty. You were speaking a truth. Sure, you were crossing a line, but in that moment, you were speaking your truth, and you were one of the last Americans in Aleppo.
Yeah.
Where you then testified about what you saw. You become a keeper of human history, human atrocity.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, and I think that's a positive thing. But what you have to so speak your truth, absolutely, but just understand that like you can only do what you can do. Okay. Mm-hmm. And your job isn't to fight for more. Your job is to do the best work that you can do, to bear witness, to tell the world what you've seen. And then really you have to kind of let it go out there into the universe and take on whatever shape or form it's going to take on. And that's really hard to do sometimes. And it can be soul destroying. But if you want to go the long mile, or what's the expression? If you want to go the distance in this industry, then you have to take a more humble approach to what's possible. And you have to replenish yourself in between trips, in between stories, and not become so utterly consumed by every story you cover that you no longer have anything left to give.
That's so true. And for anybody who's thinking about what they want to do with their life. You know, you said you describe it as a calling. Everybody has some sort of a calling. It can be big, it can be small, it can be quiet, it can be loud. What is it in your, even like the physical feeling, you know, for me, I can't not write. If I
Yeah.
stopped writing, I would stop breathing. If I stopped telling stories, if I stopped figuring out how words fit together in the
Yeah.
most compelling way, that's what I need to do. And you
Yeah.
said you felt like you have to go to these conflicts. So I can even say it's a physical feeling. I almost feel it in the palms of my hand and the way that I breathe. If
Yeah.
someone's searching for that, what would
Yeah.
you tell them to look for in themselves, their thought process, the way they spend a day?
Yeah. It's such a good question because I realize that it's kind of a privilege to have that feeling of a vocation or a calling. And I know a lot of people, certainly a lot of people I went to college with who are brilliant and they can do anything. And that's part of the problem because they can do anything. They can't pick one specific thing because it then narrows the field of opportunity. I think that you really have to quiet your mind and spend some time just sitting with, not thinking about, but just sitting with, like in your gut, what gives you joy? What gives you that feeling of animus, of being passionate, of being animated? What makes you excited? What makes you enthusiastic? What is charging to you? That is going to be, whatever it is, work out how to build on that because that raw element of passion and enthusiasm and curiosity or whatever comes with it, that is the bare bones for what it is that you should be doing or what your calling might be. And I think so often we have all these other ideas in our head, but this is what I'm supposed to do. But this is what makes most money. But this is what my mother said I should do. But this is what my friend said I should do. But this is what he does. But this is what society says is important. Try, if you can, in any way, shape, or form, try to tune that out and just what excites you, what interests you. Follow that, go with it, work with it. Now, that's not going to be enough to guarantee success, okay? The reality is that's your starting point. Then, in order to really achieve, you have to be willing to give 110% every day. And I was so struck watching this documentary on Netflix, The Last Dance, about Michael Jordan.
Mm.
And you assume with athletes, oh, the guy's like a brilliant athlete and he just gets on the court and dribble, 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 dunk, 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 and it all just happens. No, you watch this documentary and you realize that's just the basic level. Michael Jordan, every single game, 110%, 110%, 110%. And as any of us know who do a job, to bring that level of competition, of enthusiasm, of passion, of focus to your work every single day that's the challenging bit. That's the bit that's going to make you excel in your field. And that is a much harder thing to find, frankly, because you have to have, it's like a furnace, right? And you got to have a lot of coal or whatever it is that's keeping that furnace roaring. You need to be getting replenished, and that makes it that you can keep pushing forward and further. That's the hard bit, not burning out.
Yeah, it's like what you're saying about identifying what it is that first bolt of electricity that
Yeah.
gets you excited, and then what is the constant, the electricity, the power
Yeah.
that keeps you going. And I've certainly, I remember just seeing Aladdin of all things on Broadway and the genie, the actor who was playing the genie. I mean, we're talking like triple backflips. He was dripping sweat.
Yeah.
He had the biggest smile and so much energy in his eyes. And I would think of him sometimes when I'd go into to anchor or I'd start a new
Yeah.
manuscript and I'd say, where's your genie sparkle right now?
Yeah.
Because every single time he had to bring it for an audience that had never seen it, no matter how tired he was, he had to
Yeah.
give this magic. And whether you're a performer or you're a doctor or you're a teacher, it's about giving everybody something as if they're the only ones,
Yeah.
and as you head out and do these stories, I mean, it's almost like it is every story is the only story in
Every
that
story is
moment.
the only story. And I never forget, I went on an embed as a producer in Iraq with a Fox News correspondent called Rick Leventhal.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the stories in Iraq, they started to feel like they were kind of samey. And we went to this town and we were doing a story on like a young band of guys who the US military were trying to like train them to be kind
Okay.
of, in the Iraqi army, basically. And I was like, yawn, this story's been done 100 times before. And Rick and the cameraman, Brian, like pulled me aside and they were like, this is the job. And the job is to tell the story every time in a new and creative and passionate and committed way that like the audience is still going to be like, wow, that's interesting. Or like, okay, this is a different way of looking at that. Or that's the job. The job is not just being handed amazing stories on a platter every time. The job is being handed a lot of stories that, yeah, okay, we're a little bit like we've seen this sort of before. And how do I make it excellent? And that's what separates, you look at the work that 60 Minutes do. They're covering a lot of the same stories of other people. How do they make it excellent? They make it human. They find great characters. They understand that the interview is a dance, and they take it to the next level. And that is really what separates, greatness in your field from just sort of treading water.
How will you dance each time a little bit differently? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so true. You were at 60 Minutes, which is probably one of the last vestiges of this sort of long form journalism that is mainstream. Obviously we can find these documentaries. There's so much available online now, but it's the traditional form that we started watching. I mean, I watched it since I was a kid with my family.
Yeah.
You went from Fox overnights on the desk, and each place that you've worked basically at every major network but NBC.
I've been around.
But you were on a mission. It's not necessarily that you were jumping around, you were climbing up. Take us through that journey a little bit. How you started at Fox and why you moved from there, and then on and on in the direction that you did.
So it's really interesting to me because so many people have this idea of like, well, you find the company that you love and then you stay there. Okay. And there's something to be said for that. And honestly, I really feel like I found that with CNN, and I can't imagine leaving.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when I was progressing in my career, and especially, those first couple of contracts as a journalist, I wasn't interested in just staying with a company because they were the best company, or because they had 60 Minutes, or because whatever, they had the most money, or because they had the most viewers. I was always approaching every contract with one thing in mind: who is going to give me the best opportunities to do the best work that I can do and to help me excel to the next level in my career. That was, and this is why so many people are like, how did you ever leave 60 Minutes? Like, they can't get their head around it. It doesn't make any sense to them. And I say, I loved 60 Minutes. I learned so much from the work that I did there. And I'm hugely privileged to have spent some time there. But CNN came along and they had the best opportunity for me to embark on the next level of my career. And so that's the direction I went in. I think also, if you look at the sort of arc of my career, I started out as a Moscow intern with CNN. When I was watching after 9/11, I was watching CNN. CNN was always my passion. It's always the place I kind of imagined I would end up, partly because I lived a very international life, especially as a child. And so that was so appealing to me, the fact that they have this huge global apparatus, that they're seen around the world. That was definitely very appealing to me about CNN. And then when I finished my internship at CNN, they said, oh, well, you're going to have to wait a while for this girl to leave on the desk before we can offer you a job in New York. Well, Fox News came around a week later and they're like, you can start working here tomorrow. So I went and worked at Fox. Okay. Because at the end of the day, I just wanted my first break, my first opportunity. ABC News was like, we have an opportunity for you to be a reporter in Moscow. So I went to Moscow. So my point being, you have to make the best decisions for you and your career, and be brave enough to have faith in yourself and your own ability to do great work, no matter where you work. Don't make a decision based solely on like, oh, well, but this company won more Emmys than that company did at the Emmys this year. It doesn't matter. Where am I going to be able to win Emmys? Where am I going to get the opportunity to do the work? That's the question you should be asking yourself.
It takes a little bit of courage too, though, to walk away from, you were saying before that there's always these external, the external noise that
Yeah.
tells you what you're supposed to do. And so the shifts in our career too, as we continue to chase that fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm always really interested in asking people about is how to not be scared to change course and to
Right.
know. And I think, what you're saying is it's about where you fit, where your voice
Yeah.
can be heard the most. And really it's all internal, looking in, looking in, looking in versus all of
Yeah.
that outside clutter and
100%.
clatter.
The
Yeah.
other real misconception is that you always, like, everything has to look perfect and you have to achieve, achieve, achieve. Actually, you're going to learn some of your best lessons from failure. And I know that's a cliche, but it's so true. So after my first time on air for Fox, and I was doing nonstop live shots on Saddam Hussein, and then for a few rotations, I was in Baghdad for them and doing embeds with the Marines in Anbar province and doing strong work and, getting really nice feedback. But at the end of it, Fox didn't want to offer me a job, right?
Mm.
I was, I wore my hair up. I had a slightly funny accent. It was like they were like, oh, we don't really know what to do with her. She seems like, she's fine to have as a freelancer, but she is not the voice of Fox, right? She's not what we see as a Fox
The
girl.
image per se.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, like, that's fine with me. Okay. But you know what? They did me a favor. Okay. Because having that sense of, at first I was like, oh, I'm so hurt. I've been risking my life and doing good work for them. And why would they not want to give me a full-time job? Thank God they didn't give me a full-time job. I didn't belong at Fox. That wasn't the right fit. That's nothing personal. It's not really even failure, although it felt like it at the time. And then what do you know? ABC News comes up and, oh, we need someone in Moscow and you speak Russian and da 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 da. So this makes sense. And it works beautifully. And if I had been locked into a contract with Fox, I never would have been able to take that opportunity. So you kind of have to have a little bit of faith in the universe. If something isn't working out, if it's not going your way, it might be that it's just not meant to be. And that's okay. It's not a big deal. Something else is going to come along. And exactly to what you're saying, it may be that you need to rethink your role a little bit. I mean, who knows where this industry is going? I don't need to tell you the way we're telling stories is changing every 5 minutes, right? And you have to be ready to adapt. You have to be ready to move with the times. You can't take everything so personally.
I remember my first the internship that I mentioned when 9/11 happened, that first day in the newsroom. That week, my professor who was leading up that program in Washington D.C. had us answer a little questionnaire about ourselves as she got to know us, and she said, "Are you a reporter first or a writer first?" And here I was, little reporter down in the Capitol. I had all these big dreams. I'm a reporter. I'm a reporter. I'm absolutely a reporter. I was not a reporter at all. All I knew was who, what, where, when, why is what you're supposed to ask. And I had taken a couple of classes in journalism, but I had been writing since I could hold a pen. I'd been telling stories since I could talk. I'd been telling stories since I could draw. And, I thought that I was a reporter because that's what I wanted to be. But it took me probably until, I don't know, yesterday to figure out that my calling is as a writer, and I fit my writing and my love into the job of reporter because I love to tell people's stories. But if you took away that reporter job, there are other places that my writing heart could live and thrive. But it took a long time for me to figure that out because I saw myself as my job, not the skill and the energy that was feeding that job.
Yeah. No, I think that's so interesting. And people always ask me, especially now that I have kids, they're like, oh, do you want to be an anchor now? Right? Do you want to have your own show? Right? That's the next step up, right? Is to have a show. And for years, I was always like, I really don't want that, but why don't I want that? I should want that, right? Like that's society tells me that that's the next step up. And then I had a sort of epiphany. I was like, no, my strength, what I love to do is tell stories And for me, telling stories is all about finding connection with people in the most extraordinary and bizarre and foreign of circumstances. I can't do that if I'm, it's hard to do that as an anchor of an
There's
everyday news show.
there's layers between you
Yeah,
and
and
that
there's layers between
humanity.
you, and you're churning through a few stories a day, and blah blah
Yeah.
blah. And so it's so much clearer to me now. I'm like, oh, even like what you're saying. Yes, of course I'm a reporter, but I'm a storyteller first.
Hmm.
And that is what I love. That's what the job is. And the minute the job isn't that, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to go down and do live shots for hours on end when breaking news happens, and that's a part of the job too. But if I couldn't tell the stories, if I couldn't travel and put together these pieces that are often 6, 8, 10 minutes, like that's, for me, that's where the juice is. So that's really fundamentally, now I understand that about myself and what I need, whatever shape my career will take in the future. Fundamentally, if storytelling isn't a part of it, then like it's not going to be for me.
I'm kind of glad we didn't stumble on each other in some strange twist of fate when we were both 22, because
Yeah,
it sounds like we would have, climbed on the next rocket ship to, we can achieve
yeah,
everything right now,
yeah,
yesterday,
yeah,
in this moment, because it takes some time to realize that to speed up, you have to slow down.
yeah.
You have to take your time, and you will get there. And I know that sounds cliche too, but
No, but
when
it's
you're
true.
when you're racing, you get messy, and when you're racing, you leave yourself open to judging yourself, and you think you're failing when you haven't even achieved what it is that you're supposed to be, to
Yeah,
consider the fact that you haven't reached it yet.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really true. I think that's really true. And I think, one of the biggest problems I think with the sort of American mindset
Mm-hmm.
is that we value success above and beyond anything else, and it's always a race, and it's always about who gets there first, and it's not always who has the best singing voice, it's who sings the loudest. And you can get to a certain place with that sort of mindset, but ultimately, to really get to where you really want to be, you have to be willing, exactly as you're saying, to like slow down, think it, feel it, sit with it, and do, but have some, introspective moments, because otherwise you're just like a little gerbil on a wheel, furiously running away, but you don't really know what you're running towards anymore.
Right, and you might not even be moving.
Yeah.
What are you most proud of in terms of I
Oh,
guess in life? I mean, sometimes it's easy to say, as a mom too, you look at your children, you look at them looking back, and it almost goes without saying, motherhood is so fulfilling. But in your career itself, your stories,
mm,
what do you stand behind and say, that is everything I set out to do?
yeah. So I think that like my work in Syria is definitely what I'm proudest of. There was so much love and passion and commitment that went into that, that I can't not be proud of it. Even though in many ways I didn't achieve what at a certain point I was hoping would be a sort of unintended or intended consequence of it. But I think I'm proud of that work. I'm proud of a lot of other work I've done too, but more broadly speaking, when I think of what it is in terms of like as a body of work that I'm proud
Yeah.
of, I would say I'm proud of the fact that, first of all, I'm a real team player. Television, as you know, is not a solo sport, right?
No.
It is collaborative. And that is, for me, really a very exciting part of what it is that we do, and brainstorming with your team and
That
traveling to
energy.
places and sharing these experiences, and even going through the edit process. And oh my gosh, it can be so painful, and everyone's pulling their hair out. But I really am a team player in that sense. Like everybody's input is hugely valuable, and I take it on board, and we really collaborate together to create whatever it is that we're working on. And then the other thing I would say is I am incredibly mindful of my responsibility to the people whose stories I tell, whether that's a source who needs to be protected,
Hmm.
or someone I interview who needs to have their face hidden. I really pride myself on being very ethical in how I approach these issues. Even if I'm interviewing someone, and it's happened to me before, I've interviewed a jihadi and had a call from a Western government that should remain nameless, and they've asked me for the raw video of the tapes of the communication of the interview, and I've refused because I don't work for the government.
Right.
I don't work for the
And that's
intelligence
hard.
services. It's really hard because, like, of course,
It's
I don't
hard.
want this person to do, you know, to do
Hurt
anything. I
anybody,
mean,
but
if I really thought that they posed an imminent threat, then of course, you know,
right.
that would be another conversation. But for the most part, if you tell a source you're going to protect their identity, then you
have
really got to protect their identity, or else your
Right.
word doesn't mean anything. And I hope at this stage of my career that my word still counts for something.
You know that at this stage in your career, you've done more than many people will do, you know, in double time, right? I mean, we talked about slowing down, but I would argue otherwise. You're moving pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how to slow down. I think, you know, there's different news cycles, and the level of interest changes, and the story changes, and you adapt, and you find stories that speak to that moment. Obviously, for all of us who cover international news, with President Trump in the White House, it's an interesting 4 years, because America is very focused on its own political and domestic turmoil right now, understandably, which means that you have to be a lot more creative about how you pitch international stories, how they can sort of feed into the zeitgeist, or what is interesting or engaging to Americans at any one stage. And that is not always easy. And sometimes you have to just accept that, like, the news gods are not on your side, and you're just going to, like, chill for a little while, which is why I have to say it wasn't intentional, but having my baby at this time and being
The timing is perfect.
And take my maternity leave in the sort of 2 months before the next presidential election, I'm like, okay, that was.
You're like, thank you for that, universe.
Thank you for that, news gods. You really did me a solid on that one.
You know, a lot of chasing down what we believe to be our own happily ever afters involves slaying the dragon, and whatever that dragon may be. You have a lot of external, you know, dragons that fit technical definitions when you're covering conflict and war. But what about the internal dragons and demons? What's been the hardest thing for you to overcome in terms of getting in your own way?
So, you know, the saying that perfect is the enemy of good, right? And that is a big one for me. There's a tendency sometimes with the story, and you have this perfect idea of how you want everything to look and be, and when it's not all working out the way you want, you have a moment where you're like, oh, maybe I'm just going to throw in the towel on this, or maybe I'm going to just try a different approach altogether. And you have to be willing to understand and accept that not every story you do is going to be a blockbuster prize winning piece, right? And it doesn't need to be. It needs to be ethical, solid journalism that you've put some effort into, and that is accurately telling you know, at least one side of a story. And that's your job. It doesn't always have to be glory. Right. And I think there's a lot of glory hunting in this industry, particularly as correspondents have become more a part of the story than they ever were, and like your experience is part of the story. And there's kind of been this lowering of the fourth wall, where the reporter was really talking to the audience, like, about their interior experience making the piece at the same time. And all of that has been really interesting and really engaging, and I think a very positive trend in storytelling. But it does mean that you feel, I think, compelled sometimes to make a story super dramatic, or make it relevant in some way. And you really need to be able to know when you have an exceptional story, and fine, go for it. And when you have just a regular story, and that's okay too. And that is part of the job as well. And, you know, it doesn't always have to be this kind of blaze of glory moment. So yeah, that's always an education process, especially when you're younger in your career and you have your first couple of like wow moments, right, where you're doing reporting that everyone's talking about and you're winning awards and you're like, woo. And then you're going to do your next report and you're like, wait, how am I going to win an award for this? Like, how am I going to, and that can be a little poisonous, that mentality, and it needs to go, honestly. And then you grow out of it because you do another bunch of reports and realize, I'm not going to win a report for everything I do, because actually I'm not the most fabulous reporter that ever lived in the world. I got lucky. I worked hard, but I got lucky too. And that's not going to happen every time. And that's okay. I still have a valuable contribution to make. And frankly, it's not always about me.
Right. It's, my husband was a reporter for many years too, and he would always tell me, in terms of surfing, he'd say, if you paddle hard into every single wave, you're going to miss the big one. You're going to burn out all your energy, and you're going to miss riding that big, perfect wave. So
100%.
you have to pick your waves. We have such an engaged, audience today. It's been amazing seeing everybody, saying hello to you and taking inspiration from your journey. But I just wanted to say, because Instagram likes to keep us within the confines of an hour, which is probably good, because I would talk to you all day and you'd say, hey, this is my day off. I want to go to sleep maybe. But if there is anybody who has a question, I always like to make sure that we invite them to participate and have the opportunity to ask you something while we kind of wrap up our talk.
Away.
Yeah, ask, it's just, I always ask all of my guests too, if you could finish the sentence, to find your fairy tale, ... And we've hit on it a little bit, but to find your fairy tale, how would you finish the sentence?
Tune out the noise of other people's ideas of what your fairy tale should be, and let it come from an authentic place. And that's much easier said than done. But like, your actual fairy tale may not be the fairy tale that you've been brought up to think is your fairy tale.
That's so true.
As we know today, it's like a lot of people are like, what's up with Cinderella? Like, that was some messed up stuff. I mean, like, if you're a feminist.
If you look at the very original versions of these fairy tales, they were cautionary tales to scare children into going to sleep and to listen to their parents. And some of them were twisted, satires on bad leadership. And I look, and I mean, the most disturbing one was Sleeping Beauty, which was one of my favorites growing up. Even that is interesting, in the sense that we've taken dark tales, and over time society has turned them into this sparkly moment of glory, because we like to make things things maybe prettier than they are. And that's why your career is so very interesting. I joked around sometimes as a journalist, everyone else is up on the bridge going, what a beautiful sunset. And I'm underneath going, structural integrity issues. Somebody just got killed down here. The whole thing is coming down. And
It's so
you're
true.
Providing the service, but you have to highlight some of the ugly things to help us survive and get better.
Yeah. I saw a question in here, but now I can't, it kind of scrolled by me.
Yeah, I saw, let's see. I mean, I see a lot of comments, but if there are any questions, if we missed one.
In your book about balancing out your life at work versus at home mentally. Well, I guess I'll just quickly speak to that, which is, I'm sure you found this as well at times. It is really hard to navigate that weird shuttling between worlds, right? And whether it's going to war and then going on vacation in the south of France with your family and friends and drinking rosé by the pool, and 2 days ago you were in the rubble in Aleppo, or whether it's something a little bit less dramatic than that, it still is really tough to make sense of that, and to be able to straddle two worlds, and to do it without feeling guilt, to be able to embrace the joy and the luxury if you might have a nice vacation or whatever it is, and to be able to embrace normalcy when you have the opportunity to do so. But I learned at a certain stage in my career that it's essential, if you are going to make it in this industry, if you're going to sustain that level of passion and commitment to do this work, you have to have a normal life as well, surrounded by people you love, doing things that make you happy. And sometimes you're going to have to fake it till you make it. You're not going to feel that connection right away. You're going to feel detached, and you want to be with the people you were with in the field. but you just have to work really hard at it, because those people, those friends, those places, that love, that's what's going to get you through it in the long run.
That's going to be your fuel. A couple other questions that came in. One of our viewers wanted to know about upcoming projects that you're excited about, and then another question was, what do you see as one of the biggest problems right now in the media in terms of even social media and all of the clutter and kind of conflicting news that's out there? So I don't know, which one you want to start with first.
I'll start with social media. Has been Pandora's box, right? On the one hand, wow, how exciting that we have a more vibrant, diverse chorus of voices telling stories, giving different perspectives, much needed, desperately needed. And that is a wonderful, beautiful thing that is only enriching our cultural lives, but also our understanding of world events. And so that's fantastic. On the other hand, what it means is that anyone can go and have an egg as a profile photo and then get 10,000 followers and start saying that aliens are going to, abduct the president. And then
someone will believe them somewhere.
And then they can say that you're fake news. Okay. And so how do you deal with people who are abusing the system to the point where facts go out the window? That's a real challenge for young journalists today. I think it's going to be their biggest challenge. How do you respond to your job and your calling and do the work in this age of misinformation? And for me, it's about, you tune out the noise, you ignore the egg on Twitter, and you stick to facts. You accept the fact as well that obviously we all have our own biases, and we come to our stories with our upbringing and our race and our religion baked into that. But as long as we're all sticking to facts, that's okay. That's a good thing. It's when you throw away the fact book and start just talking absolute nonsense and conspiracy theories that you start to really erode an essential social function that journalism is there for, which is, by the way, for the people ultimately. So that's the answer to that. In terms of upcoming projects, I'll just say that I'm very interested in investigative pieces at the moment, and particularly investigative pieces looking at Russia. And that's sort of all I can say for now.
Oh, I like that. You know how to tease it. Another one more question, if we can squeeze it in, was just, did you ever doubt it for a young journalist? You mentioned that even with the social media world, did you ever doubt whether it was all worth it?
Yeah, but only in my much earlier, when I was on the overnight assignment desk, and the highlight of the night was cheese fries arriving from the local deli, and I was watching, reality TV shows with Paris Hilton, not like on the television in the background while I sat alone on the graveyard shift. Yeah, I had moments of thinking, is this worth it? Am I barking up the wrong tree? Is this what I want to do? Definitely. But once you start doing the work that you love and you have the passion for it, yeah, of course, it's worth all of it and more.
It starts repaying you. What you put in, you get back. The input output at some point has to meet, and it's not always going to.
When you're starting out, it's miserable. It's miserable. The first few years are miserable. There's no way of getting around it. Okay, it's just going to be miserable.
I used to write. I found old journals, Clarissa, where I would write, I hate that I love it. I love that I hate it. I hate it. I love it. And I would play around with the order of it to try to figure out which version was true. And I think it was that I hate that I love it, because it made me so tired, and it took away. You miss a lot of moments with family, and it is tough, but it also has let me, in a small way, compared to the world that you've covered, even if it's just a family that's lost everything in a fire, or a city that is celebrating its first World Series win, those feelings of collective emotion is what fills up my well. And I think that when I was contemplating talking to you this morning, I started thinking about how when you look into the heart of what's wrong in our world, it helps you look into, the heart of humanity is how I would put it. And it helps us better understand ourselves. So I so appreciate what you're doing, and I so appreciate you taking time to talk to me. I mean, anybody who hasn't read this book, it does not read like a memoir at all. it reads like I'm reading it like I'm watching an amazing movie. And from your childhood to the
Thank
adventures that
you.
you had, it is impeccably written, and I would suggest it to anybody who hasn't picked it up yet. Thank you so much for spending some
Thank
time
you
with
so much.
us.
I've loved our conversation, and thank you guys for listening, and talk to you soon, I hope.
I hope so too. Have a wonderful rest of your maternity leave and stay
Thank
safe.
you. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye bye. Everyone, if this doesn't convince you to shut out the noise outside, and this conversation hasn't inspired you to listen to what it is that brings you that joy, that fills up your energy, I don't know what would. I so appreciate you joining me at a different time, on a Monday morning, but talk about Monday motivation and setting your intention for the rest of the week and maybe the rest of your life. We'll be back tomorrow as